Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on using the ESAP or ESAP framework with Gold New Edition to help you with quick and easy planning for effective online lessons. So I can see lots of you writing in the chat box. Hello to everyone. If you can hear me okay, if you could just write yes, that would be excellent, just so we can check the sound. Yep, so we've got people coming from all over. We've got Peru, Lithuania, Ecuador, Greece, Latvia, Bavaria and Germany, Poland, Switzerland, Croatia. Nice, perfect. Argentina, Turkey. Hi to everyone. I'm in the UK, so we haven't had anyone else from the UK yet. Mexico, Philippines, all over the world. Nice. So thanks for joining wherever you are, whether it's morning, evening, or afternoon. Thanks so much for coming to join this webinar today. So welcome everyone, and before we get started, if you'd like to keep writing where you're from, what the time is, where you are. As I said, I'm based in the UK, and I'll go through a little bit about me in just a moment. So just a few housekeeping points before we get started. So this webinar is being recorded and you'll be able to find it online, and you'll also receive a link to the recording if you missed anything and want to watch it back. So within 72 hours of this webinar, you'll receive that email. So it will have a link to the recording. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance, a link to Pearson's ESAP pack. So that'll include a cheat sheet and a planner, which we'll have a look at later on in the session to help you reduce your lesson planning time. And as I said, you'll also receive a link to the recording and a really useful how-to guide. So how to teach online with Gold New Edition. So it will show you all of the teacher resources, all of the digital resources, and it'll also give you another ESAP lesson that you can use as well. So as I said, you will receive all of this in an email, so do just check your junk or spam box if you haven't received this within 3 days of the webinar. So I'll be asking you guys questions throughout this session, so please do feel free to write any answers or comments or anything in the chat box. If you do have any questions, please just do try and save them until the end, when we will have some time to go through them. But if there are any burning questions, I will be having a look at the chat box as well. So here's a quick look at what you'll be receiving in your email. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the lesson planner. So how to plan an online lesson with the ESAP framework. And we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail. And then we've also got the cheat sheet, which I mentioned that you'll receive in your email, just to break down each stage and the different components you can use specifically for Gold New Edition, any level that you're using. So just a little bit about me before I get started. As I said, I'm based in the UK, and my name's Billy, and I've been in English language teaching for around 9 years, teaching in different countries. So countries such as China, Italy, Spain, Turkey as well. And then I came back to the UK to teach in a language school in Cambridge, which is where I'm now based. I came back to do my Delta, and then I became a teacher trainer and a freelance materials writer, working on exam materials, course books, and apps as well. And I also have my own teacher training company too. So hi to everyone. If you have just joined, we've got lots of people coming in from Mexico, Ukraine. Someone said you're working with C1. So this methodology can be used across all levels. We will be looking at a specific B2 lesson today, but as I said, this can be adapted and you can use some of the activities and feedback methods in your C1 lesson or any level that you're using as well. So now let's just have a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about in this session. So first of all, we'll be having a look at what the methodology is. So Magdalena Kania gave a detailed introduction into this method, but in case you missed it or any of the other ESAP webinars, we'll have a quick look at the main ideas and just break them down before we go into our lesson. Then we'll look at ways you can plan an ESAP lesson using the planner, which will be sent after the webinar that we've just seen. Then we'll move on to how we can actually deliver an online lesson with Gold New Edition. So the tools you can use, different methods of feedback, and alternative ways to conduct tasks and extend them. And finally, we'll look at the digital resources available for Gold on the Pearson English portal. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do have any questions, then we will have some time to go through at the end and answer those. Okay, so here you can see what ESAP stands for. So firstly, we have engage in the top left, then we have study, then on to activate, and then practice. So have any of you used this methodology before, I wonder? If you have, just write in the chat box and let us know. If you haven't, we will just have a quick look at what it involves before we have a look at the lesson. So some people saying yes already, a couple of people saying no. Okay, majority no, it looks like. Sort of 70-30 no. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the engage stage first of all. So this is just engaging students from the very first minute they enter the online classroom, as you would do in a real world classroom. So this could be asking questions just to get them thinking in English and just engaging with you in the online lesson. So how are you? How's your day been? How's the weather where you are? What have you been doing today? How's your family, for example? Then we have the warm-up activity where students get thinking about the unit topic. Often this is already in the course book. And this retrieves their prior knowledge and language that they have about this topic. Then we have study, which is the typical presentation and controlled practice of the target language or grammar. So the language is introduced and then students complete controlled activities. So we're monitoring them, error correcting as much as we can. And we'll look at different ways we can monitor our students in the online classroom as well. So I think this stage differs from a face-to-face lesson because the main goal here is to just ensure that the teacher talking time's kept to a minimum, and we do use different ways to present language and keep students engaged rather than simply just explaining with words and sort of boring them and sending them to sleep, because often their cameras are off and we can't see if they're listening to us. So I think with online lessons, it is really important just to think about the engagement and the motivation of students, particularly in the presentation of language, the practice and the feedback, because often in the classroom we have a heads down approach, which works really well. But as I said, we just need to make sure that students are engaged and we're thinking of different dynamic ways to do the tasks. Then we have activate, so the third stage in our methodology. So here students have the opportunity to practice the language themselves in a much freer way. And often this involves a lot of oral production of the target language. So we can use pair and group work, whole class activities and discussions, and generally just ways to try and get students using the language as orally as possible in the activity and also in the feedback, so we can do some delayed error correction as well. Then finally, we have the practice section, so the last stage of our method, where students can do further activities and exercises outside of the online classroom for self-study, which is really important in an online class just to maintain the motivation and ensure that students are still learning as much as possible. So this can be to reinforce language from the lesson, for extra support, or for a challenge. So now we've looked at a brief overview of the methodology. Let's see how we can plan our lessons. So first of all, just a quick question for you all. Do you find it takes longer to plan online lessons than face-to-face? And if so, how long does it usually take you to plan your online lessons? So I'll just give you a moment to write your answers in the chat box. Alejandra, 3 hours, that's a really long time. Hopefully we can look at some ways that you can reduce that, because that seems like a long time. Natasha said about the same, it's just different. I agree, it is completely different because you've got to think about the digital components, flicking from one platform to the next, how to easily access it and go to each one as well. Chiren said 2 to 3 hours. Wow. Yeah, at the early stage, online lessons do take longer to plan if we're not used to teaching online, exactly. 90 minutes, wow, 2 to 3 hours, William as well, that's That is definitely a long time, particularly if you have a couple of lessons a day. It really is a lot, especially if you have to do marking and things as well. Some people have said it's easier. I think as you get used to it, it definitely becomes more easy. So we will just have a look at how we can reduce it, particularly for those like Isabel who just said 2 hours or more. Okay, so let's have a look at a lesson plan that I made for the lesson that we're going to do today. Of course, just before we have a look, all teachers do plan differently, and all teachers do spend different lengths of time with planning their lessons. But after this webinar, you will receive the cheat sheet and the planner, which we saw the cheat sheet earlier, and here's an example of the planner. Hopefully this will help you reduce your planning time because you can focus on each individual section and think quite easily, what's the aim of it, what's the outcome, and then what's the feedback that I'm going to do. So hopefully this will help you plan a more engaging, but also a lesson that you can plan quicker than maybe you have been doing previously. So because we're using a lot of digital resources in our online lessons, it's really important we have our technology sorted, as lots of you have probably experienced, and that we know where to find each component that we're going to use in the lesson as well, just to help us access it easily so we don't lose our students' attention if we're having a technical problem. So the ESAP Planner can help you save time in your planning, as I said, by breaking down the clear steps. So engage, study, activate, and practice. So this is a quick lesson plan that I put together for the gold lesson we'll be looking at today. So we've got the stage, then we've got the content section. So you can write in as much or as little detail as you like, what you're going to be teaching, perhaps some discussion questions, even timings if you prefer to prepare how long each activity is going to last as well. Then on the right, we have the notes section, which I'd recommend using for 2 things. So firstly, as a note to help you know where to access your digital tools. So for example, you can see that I've used Mentimeter here. So I know that I have to have that website open for my lesson. And the second thing I'd use the notes section for is to write how I'm going to get feedback in a particular activity, because often this is something that takes a lot of getting used to, a lot of practice, and something that you have to consider, which in a real life classroom we wouldn't have to. So in a real world classroom, we can nominate a student, they can put their hands up. But I think online, there are lots of different ways we can do it. So I think it's best to prepare how each activity best works with a certain feedback. So we have something like peer feedback, students writing in the chat box, nominating students to unmute themselves, for example, and speaking aloud. So as I said, I'd probably just make a note of how feedback can be done in each activity. So we're not wasting time with students' minds wandering as we're getting feedback. As I said, every teacher does plan differently, but hopefully by using this step-by-step plan, it can help you follow the methodology and also reduce your planning time, particularly for those that said it takes 2 to 3 hours, because that's a lot on you if you have to plan for multiple lessons. One more thing I think is really important to mention is that you can access Zoom through the Pearson English portal, which you have access to with Gold New Edition. So you can schedule your classes through there too. So by accessing Zoom through the portal, you've got everything in one place. So as we said, just keeping all of your technology together to save time. So you've got your student's etext on there, so the copy of the student's book, and also your digital teacher resources as well. So you can log on to your teacher dashboard, and next to your products and classes, you'll see class schedule, and you'll need to connect your Zoom account, and all of your lessons will appear on your dashboard here. As you can see, I currently don't have any classes scheduled. So yeah, this is just my example. Another thing to mention is that you can share your screen with your students to display the digital version of Gold on Active Teach. So that's the digital version of your student's book, and we'll look at this in more detail a little bit later on. Okay, now let's have a look at how we can use the plan and our ideas to deliver an online lesson using this ESAP framework or ESAP framework using Gold New Edition. So we're going to be looking at Gold B2, so Unit 1, vocabulary, speaking and listening. So we've combined this all into one lesson. And if you are using B2, that you can find this lesson on pages 6 and 7 in your print book or an active teach. So as I said, if you're not teaching with B2, it doesn't matter, because all of these activities, feedback methods and extensions can be adapted to suit your level as well. So a question for you guys before we look at the engage section. So what's the first thing that you do when your students enter your online class? There's no right or wrong answer here. It'll just be interesting to see your different ideas and how you get students engaged. So I'll just give you a moment to write your answers in the chat box. So Sharon said there's some music before the lesson. I like that, to get them motivated, get some energy going. Monica said, I ask how they are. Excellent. Natasha says, get them doing something in the chat box, small talk, chatting a little bit. Basata says, asking them what we did last class. That's really nice as well. That really gets them thinking in English. Say hello, yeah, greet them and ask them what they did the other day. Perfect. Maria says, questions about their day at school and activities. Nice. Yeah, greet them, welcome them to the class, ask them how they are, review about the last class. Excellent, yeah. So that's all that we sort of suggest in the engage stage as well. So as soon as students enter the online lesson, it's really important we ask them how they are, how their day's been, what they've been doing, all the questions that you guys said in the chat box. So this just really shows that we care, we're engaging our students, and even if we can't be with them face to face, we do still care and we are still there to help them and teach them, even if it is online. We're also linking the real world to our online classroom just by sort of talking about the outside environment and things like that. As I think most of us would do in a real life classroom anyway, but I think maybe as teachers we get so sort of caught up in what we're trying to teach and all the platforms we're trying to use. We just need to remember to do that when the students enter the lesson. So we could ask students to write in the chat box. If we ask them a question, as many of you said, what have you been doing today, for example, and then students can write their answers. Or you could even nominate students as they're coming in or as they settle in to unmute themselves and say a couple of sentences about their day or from last lesson, as you mentioned in the chat box as well. So if your lesson you're teaching that day links to a previous lesson, you could maybe, if you've assigned practice tasks in My English Lab, which comes with gold, you could use the common error report to tell you what you need to go over or revisit. So you could touch on those in the engaged questions as well. And we'll look at that in detail a little bit later on. But My English Lab shows you student scores, which activities the class or individuals struggled with that you have assigned them. So if you're unsure on how to use this feature, there will be a gold new edition how-to guide sent to you after this webinar in that email. So do be sure to have a look and check your junk or spam box as well, because My English Lab is a really, really useful tool which supports students and provides that extra practice that they need as well. So here's the first page of our unit. So B2 Unit 1, Bands and Fans, page 6 and 7. So you'll see, first of all, I've got an arrow pointing to the leading questions. We've already engaged students, said, how are you? What have you been doing? Then we have a leading question, which is also part of the engaged stage, where students work in pairs and discuss what activities they enjoy either alone or with friends and family. So some examples are given. So we've got sports, cultural events, classes, visiting new places, for example. So we can try and encourage students to think of their own ideas as well. So I think how we deliver this activity and how we get feedback on this activity really does depend on how long you want to make it and how long your class is. So you could simply have students write their ideas in the chat box, or alternatively, you could organise breakout rooms, which are available on Zoom, and I think many other platforms as well. And students could chat in pairs or small groups about their ideas. It might not be as important for the lead-in, as this is more just to get students thinking, but do make sure you pop in and out of breakout rooms where you can, just to make sure students are on topic and that they're speaking in English, particularly if you do have a monolingual class, so all students that speak the same language. Now, the next activity, so this is designed to elicit students' existing knowledge of the target language. So we've moved on to the study section, the second part of our lesson, as this is where we're starting to present that language and use it in a controlled way. So this activity requires students to give examples of verbs often found with the activities that they just mentioned in the lead-in. So you could extend this by displaying some of the students' answers from the first activity. So as they're saying them, you can write them down and then display them on screen, for example, if they said anything different to the suggested answers. And there are a couple of ways to do this activity. So you as the teacher could call each word aloud. So for example, the first one we've got is clubbing. And you could have students write a verb that goes with it in the chat box. For example, go, or like, or dislike. And you could also put students into groups in breakout rooms to discuss their ideas, learn from each other perhaps. And then when they come back to the main room, you can nominate those pairs or groups to write their answers in the chat box. So with an activity like this, because we're focusing on collocations, I think it's really important to remind students to have a pen and paper with them, even though they are working on the computer. Just remind them to make a note of any collocations, because chunking language is really, really useful to help students develop their fluency. So it'll be helpful for them to keep a collocations diary, perhaps, so with a verb at the top of the page and the collocating words underneath, particularly if they are verbs and nouns, because they're really useful chunks to use. So we've got, for example, go clubbing, play or buy computer games, do exercise, hate exercise, like exercise, and so on. So it'll be interesting to see what verbs students come up with. On to the next activity in our study stage, where students complete sentences about what they do in their spare time. Now, some of these phrases might be new for students, and there's no sort of pre-teaching in the book itself here. You could add something in and first do a short activity to elicit the meaning of each statement, or for students to work them out. So you could ask students to turn their camera on and put a thumbs up if they think the statement is positive, and thumbs down, or another signal that you feel comfortable with if the sentence is negative. So for example, I quite enjoy. Students' cameras are on, thumbs up, they think it's a positive statement. And again, that gets the whole class working together, and it shouldn't affect any bandwidth or internet connection, because students aren't saying anything, it's just quickly looking at them on the camera. So as there are only a few sentences, this might be nice just for a short period of time, and students can also see their classmates' faces as well. For the activity itself, so when students complete the sentences, get them to do this individually, then nominate students to unmute themselves and share 1 or 2 sentences with the class. So this also practices pronunciation too. You could also do a whole class activity here to extend the vocabulary practice, which we have an example here. So you could have a class vote or a ranking activity, just so everyone's working together. So the ranking activity could be, which activity do they like best? So here I've used a site called Mentimeter. So if you've used this, please do feel free to write in the chat box. So I think it is a really, really useful resource to use, and it's completely free as well. So you could choose 4 of the activities students mentioned in the feedback, or the activity from exercise 1. So we had do exercise, play video games. And then we could have students vote on their favourite, or we could do the ranking activity and rank them from their favourite to least favourite. And this could generate some really good discussion. You could also put students into breakout rooms to discuss their answers, to elaborate on them and develop their ideas, or have students unmute themselves just to explain their choices if they feel comfortable doing that. So all students need for this is their phone. So they can go to, so for the teacher, it's mentimeter.com, but for students, it's Menti. So just the first half of the word, menti.com, and they enter the code that's at the top here. So you can see mine on screen. And then they can participate as well. And as someone just mentioned in the chat box, it is a really useful tool to use because you can do word clouds, which we've also going to look at in this lesson, matching, ranking, doing class polls as well. So it's very easy to use and completely free as well. And that's just an extension of the activities in the student's book. Okay, so still on the study stage, but now moving on to the listening and speaking section. So this part is all about asking and answering questions. So the first activity is read and listen to the questions about free time. So underline the words which are stressed. Are these mainly grammar words or content words such as nouns and adjectives? So first of all, with this activity, I'd probably clarify what a grammar word is and what a content word is, just to check for understanding. So we could just answer a simple concept checking question, or we could turn it into a bit of a game, a bit of a quiz. So I could say a word, or I could write a word on screen, the teacher could. So for example, B, and then we have students write C or G in the chat box, so content or grammar word. So B would be a grammar word because it's an auxiliary verb. And then we could write something like happiness. So would that be C or G? Let's see what you say in the chat box. The word is happiness. Perfect. Marion straight away. Content word, yeah, because we've got a noun, exactly. So something just like this for the students to do very, very quickly, just to check their understanding of the terminology. So that would just take a couple of minutes, and you could do that with a couple of words just to check. So display the questions on screen for the students to read, or you could nominate students to unmute themselves and read a question aloud again to practice pronunciation and just to check the students' engagement as well. So play the audio, and with a short activity like this, I'd probably just do the feedback quite quickly in the chat box once students have listened. In the next activity in our study stage, students need to listen in a little bit more detail. So we can play the audio and then have students make a note of their answers individually. An activity like this is a really good opportunity for peer feedback where students can check their answers with each other. So you could put students into different breakout rooms to compare their answers and discuss if they heard anything differently, if they have different answers to each other. So back in the main lesson, you could ask students to write any questions that they have in the chat box. I think sometimes, particularly when your students are of a high level, maybe a B2 plus, C1, C2, it is really useful to have peer feedback and trust that they have answered correctly, especially if they have the same answers in a group, for example. We don't necessarily need to feedback on every answer all the time, but students can ask any questions just to clarify or check if they prefer. And again, that cuts down the feedback time and the teacher talking time too. So yeah, if your class are confident, do try this. Get them to feedback to each other, then allow them to ask any questions, then move on to the next activity. Now, there's also an opportunity here to extend this activity by asking students to replace some of the answers with their own ideas. So you could do this as a whole class activity to practice spontaneous spoken production, perhaps, by nominating students to unmute themselves and share their ideas with the class. For example, the first sentence, I usually find quite relaxing, but it depends on So they might say, I usually find yoga relaxing, but it depends on the noise around me. Or I usually find running quite relaxing, but it depends on the weather, for example. So any opportunities for personalization, again, builds that engagement. So then you could also get students to think about the questions in exercise. No, sorry. That's my next slide. So remember, if you are sharing your screen and teaching through Active Teach, oh, my text is a bit small there. But basically, if you are sharing your screen and teaching through Active Teach. The audio is ready to play at the point of use. So you don't need to waste time searching for audio files. As soon as you've logged on and you're displaying your screen through Active Teach, you'll see the play button as soon as you get to an audio activity, so you don't need to change platforms. You can also find the audio script if you prefer to use this to go through the answers, perhaps displaying it on screen, getting students to identify the answers. And you can add subtitles to any video if you need to as well. I do apologise about my text size there. Don't know what happened. Now, still on our study stage, we're introducing the exam task in this lesson. So from the Cambridge First exam, so the B2. We're looking at the first part of the speaking exam, so interview part 1. So again, I've used Mentimeter here to elicit what students already know about this task by using the word cloud feature that someone mentioned earlier in the chat box. So in the book itself, it doesn't sort of it does introduce speaking part 1, but it doesn't elicit what students already know. I think we should check that first of all before we revisit anything, and also just to get them thinking about prior knowledge and what they already know. So yeah, use the word cloud feature on mentimeter.com. So prepare this before the lesson to save time flicking through the different platforms, and have students access it with their phones as before using the code. So remember, if you do create different Mentimeter polls or rankings or class word clouds, then do remember that each one has a different code. So just be aware of that. So you can ask students, what do you know about the first part of the speaking exam? As you can see here that I've entered, and then students can anonymously input their ideas. They come up on a word cloud on your shared screen. So the more people that write the ideas, the bigger the word gets. So if 5 people in the class write get to know you, that will appear bigger. If 1 person writes interview, that will appear smaller. So we can see what we need to go over in particular. So I'll show you my example here. So these were just 3 things that I entered. So interview, get to know you, about you. So yeah, you can also put how many entries students are allowed to have. So I've put 3 here, so students can put 3 things that they know about the exam, but you can change that for whatever they prefer. So yeah, as I said, they do get bigger with the more students that write. So it really helps you, because you can think, oh, students aren't sure on how to do that. I can go over that in the next lesson. And you can use this with any exam style task or even a topic. What do you know about, or what food do you know with this letter, or what vegetables do you know, for example, if you're teaching a lower level. As I said, it is anonymous, so it's quite good for less confident classes as well. So we've elicited what this part of the exam includes, potentially how long it is as well. Maybe students have said that, and the type of questions that they might be asked. So next, students match the questions with the typical topics in this part of the exam in A to F. So you could get students to do this in breakout rooms in pairs, then come back to the main lesson and then nominate students to write their answers in the chat box perhaps. Then students write 2 more questions for each topic. So maybe a nice idea here would be for the same pairs to come up with questions. So the same pairs that have matched to come up with questions. Then in a different breakout room, you can put those 2 sets of pairs together. They can ask each other their questions that they've written and sort of do a practice exam as well, mini practice exam. Remember, you can pop in and out of the breakout rooms as well. Another option would be to bring students back to the main room once they've written their questions. Choose a student to read their question aloud and have them nominate another student in the class. So if Jose's written a question, he unmutes himself and asks, Sarah, and then asks her the question. She unmutes herself, answers, and then nominates someone else to answer the next question. So this is really nice because, again, it engages students. It takes you out of the equation because you don't need to sort of intervene in the feedback as well. And again, reduces that teacher talking time. Also, students have to be aware that their name might be called. So they have to be ready and engaged too. So now we're moving on to the activate stage. So the third stage in our framework. So can you remember, what does this stage involve? I'll just give you a moment to write your answers in the chat box. Yeah, so Sabine said free language production. Adriana also said free practice. Nice. Marion as well. Excellent. Yeah, Karina, collaborative learning. Exactly. Collaborative learning and freer language production. So we have done our engagement, our presentation, our controlled practice, and now we're on a freer section of the lesson where students can really use the language that they've learned. So yeah, they can express themselves, we can personalize the language, and again, as you mentioned, collaborative learning. So in this section, we have a listening activity. So you might not think that this would be freer, but it leads on to a freer activity. So it elicits some language students could use in this part of the exam, and also allows them to assess how they think other speakers did in an exam as well. So first of all, in exercise 10, play the audio, have students make a note of the ideas. So this is an example of 2 students doing the real exam of part 1, speaking. So this activity is quite short, so you could nominate students to unmute themselves and say what they wrote down in their notes, for example, what they heard, what answers they heard in the exam, or the questions or the topic, for example. So the final activity here is a bit freer. That's why I've put them both in the freer section. So we put students into small groups in breakout rooms, maybe play the listening one more time before they students make a note of their ideas. For example, what did they think of the range of grammar and vocabulary, the pronunciation? Did students develop an answer without too much hesitation? What was their opinion of the exam? Get them to be as honest and open as they like. And this is a really, really good way for students to hear a model, or perhaps not a model, things that they shouldn't do, and then use that in their own production as well. Something which I've done, which works really well when you're sort of using a model dialogue or a model in a Cambridge exam, is to use the marking scheme. So as well as doing exercise 11, if you do have a confident class or a class that you think might really like to develop their ideas here, you could give them a Cambridge marking scheme for the particular exam. And you can do this by a simple Google search online, and it's the first PDF result that comes up. So do remember, to give them a copy of that if you like, and it breaks it down into 5 sections. So if you put students into groups of 5, for example, allocate each of them a different thing to listen out for. So the range, the hesitation, the pronunciation, the general fluency and confidence as well. Students can discuss that and really get into it, and then they can go on to their practice, so they can take all of that on board. And as I said, do remember to pop in and out of the breakout rooms if you do turn this into a longer discussion as well. And I think just by giving the Cambridge marking exam, students know exactly what they have to work on, because they know what the examiner or interlocutor is going to be listening to as well, or listening for. Now, as this unit progresses, skills are then practiced with the language that we've looked at in the first section, and it's recycled throughout each lesson. So the freer practice isn't particularly long in this section, as I've just cut this to fit potentially an hour lesson, whereas there is more in this unit if you had a longer class. So for example, we can refer students back to the language that they used in the vocabulary part of the lesson. So in the first part of the study stage, you could ask them to write questions that they might find in the first part of the speaking exam using this language. So as you'll remember, the language was about activity. So we had video games, exercise, yoga, clubbing. I think there was dancing as well. So students have looked at the exam, looked at the vocabulary, and now they're writing their own questions. What sorts of exercise do you like to do? What activities do you do with your friends? Do you play any musical instruments, perhaps? And then you can put students into small groups to ask each other their questions and just have a freer discussion. And again, you could get students to nominate each other to show that they're engaged with each other, and also, again, to have students in charge of the lesson rather than you as the teacher. So that's just sort of an extension that I've added into the freer practice there. Now, on to the final stage of our ESAP lesson. So we've got practice. So as you know, this is where we give students homework and activities for self-study, extra support, or a challenge. So first of all, we have the exam maximizer. So this provides revision of the language from the units in the student's book, and a practice and extension of skills, exam tasks, language and grammar points. So for this lesson we've just looked at, if you are planning on teaching it, you can use Unit 1, page 6 of the exam maximizer. So exercises 1, 2, and then 1 of the speaking section. So this revises the language with a word search. Then we have correcting sentences with mistakes to practice the collocations that we looked at in the lesson. And then a short listening activity to further help students with the exam task. You'll also see in the exam maximizer on the left-hand side of the page that there are tips and strategies that students can refer to throughout the book to help them with exam task types as well. So you can also go to My English Lab, and there are activities for each unit, skill and exam task type. So here you can see the activities that we've got for our unit bands and fans. And these are the activities that are automatically graded. So students can access their grade book, as you can see at the top of the screen, and complete the activities. And teachers can then access the grade book to track students' progress, see a common error report, and then you can identify students' areas for improvement as well. And hopefully that will also reduce your planning time as well. So Marion just asked, is that accessible via Active Teach? So Active Teach is your students' book that you're presenting, but students will be able to access their My English Lab on their Pearson English portal, yes. They don't need the actual book unless they've never logged in before, because the code to access their portal is on the front, inside front cover of their students' book. Okay, so where are we? Yes, so you can reduce lesson planning time with your My English Lab and the grade book, because you can see what students need to focus on, what they're struggling with, and use this with your ESAP lesson planner to cut down your lesson time, hopefully from your 2 hours to about 45 minutes, which I think might be long enough. So there are also photocopyable activities you can use in your lessons. So you can access these in the print teachers books, so at the back of the print teachers books, or on the Pearson English portal, as you can see here. So it's under the section called photocopyables, and there are 3 per lesson. So for the lesson we looked at today, if you are planning on teaching it, you could use photocopyable 1A. The name of it is If This Is the Answer, What's the Question? So you can see it on screen here. So a nice way to do this would be for students to do this in small groups, organised outside of the lesson in their own time, and to discuss the questions. Or you could get students to choose 2 of the questions and record themselves speaking, then send it to you for marking. We'll have a quick look at a platform you can also use for this as well. Then we have the students' etext, where students can go over the lesson again themselves if they feel they want to revise something that maybe they didn't pick up on the first time. And they also have the audio available to play at the point of use too. So you can see our lesson here, and on activity 5, you'll see the audio icon, which means that students can listen to it directly from the etext itself. And finally, we have the Pearson English app, the old Pearson Practice app. So students can find vocabulary and grammar practice activities. And this just allows them to learn independently, to reinforce what they've learned in the lesson with you as they please and on the go. So let's just have a quick recap of the digital resources that come with Gold New Edition. So we have the course book, an exam maximizer, exam maximizer audio, a test master with a customizable placement test, progress tests, exit tests. There's also videos of speaking tests, which you could also use as an extension in the lesson we just looked at. There's photocopyables, so 3 per lesson, word lists, and active teach, which is the digital copy of your student's book. So really everything is in one place that you'll need to successfully plan and teach your lesson online. So hopefully by having everything in one place, this can reduce that lesson planning time, as we said. Now, there are also some really useful tools. We've looked at Mentimeter, but there are also some other free online tools which I'm sure you might have come across before, just to make your classes more dynamic and engaging. So first of all, we have Padlet. So it's an interactive note board. Students can add photos, text, documents, audio, snippets, links, sort of like a classroom without being face-to-face. Students can participate and engage with each other there as well. Then we've got Quizlet, which is always a popular one. I'm sure most teachers have used this. So yeah, Quizlet, you can create your own activities. Students can also create their own self-study things as well. And then we've got Flipgrid, which is a video community. So we said that we could get students to record themselves answering the photocopyable activity questions. You could use Flipgrid. So students could put their videos on there, respond to each other's. Also, if you're giving an essay topic in a writing lesson, Flipgrid's really good because you can, as a teacher, record yourself saying the writing topic, post the video, and have students send you their essays as well. As far as I know, all of these are free. I think there are paid versions as well, but I know that Quizlet is free 100%, I do believe. If anyone knows any different, please do feel free to write. However, I've only used it for free. Yeah, we've also got Actively Learn, where you can add questions, notes, respond to an article, for example. Then we've also got Word Wall, which allows you to create custom activities, such as quizzes, word games. It sort of gamifies your lesson. And then we've got Storybird, which is really good for creative writing, which is often something students need to practice, just their writing skills. And it's also anonymous as well, so it's really good for less confident students. So yes, if anyone has used any of these resources or has anything to say about these resources, do feel free to write in the chat box. But as far as I know, they are free. There are paid versions of some of them, but all I know is that Quizlet is definitely free. We also have the links to them at the bottom here, so you can see activelylearn.com, wordwall.net, and storybird.com. But you will receive a how-to guide in your email up to 3 days after this webinar, and the links to all of these resources and the previous ones I mentioned will be in that how-to guide, so do have a look at that for sure. Now, we've looked at the ESAP methodology for teaching online, had a look at a lesson from Gold New Edition, which hopefully you can use in your class, and different ways of engaging the students and marking their activities and making the activities varied as well. And we've also had a look at some resources available for teachers on the Pearson English portal, but also externally as well. So I think we have time for some questions. So if you do have any questions, do feel free to write them in the chat box and I'll do my best to answer them for you. I'll give you just a moment. So as I said, I really hope that the lesson planner helps reduce your planning time, because as a lot of you mentioned 2 to 3 hours, I was quite shocked. Can you play Quizlet live and remote lessons, Marion? Yes, you can. Yes. So if you create the Quizlet first, it's similar to Kahoot in the fact that you can create it first, share your screen and do it with the class like that as well. Okay. What else have we got? Are there available rubrics for the ESAP framework? So you will receive a cheat sheet. I'll show you here on the right-hand side, and that will tell you all of the resources that you can use for Gold at each stage. So things in your study, things for your practice, and things for your Activate as well. just gonna have a quick look. Maria said, going back to the speaking section, why is it important for students to assess their hearing? I think you mean just to assess the way that they speak or other students speak. I think it's really important for students to hear other students speaking and assessing, because often it's hard to identify your own errors. So if I make a mistake in my sentence, for example, I might not be aware that I've said it because it's out there now. It was spontaneous production, whereas a partner might hear that and can pick up on it and let me know, and then I can improve on that as well. And in terms of why it's important to listen to test takers, I think one, because students are often very intimidated. They don't know what to expect in an exam. So just by hearing it might make them feel a bit more at ease as well. I think there is one more question. I'm not sure. So Yoshiko said, how many times should I play the audio for this level? Very good question. I think it definitely depends on your class's ability. Although B2 is a CEFR level, your class might be a lower B2, a higher B2. It definitely depends on your students. If they're preparing for an exam like IELTS, there is only one chance to listen to an audio recording. So do keep that in mind. But if they're preparing for the first or advanced, for example, with gold, then twice, I think, should be sufficient. I wouldn't play it any more than that. Sometimes you could play it once and get them to listen to a second time just to check their answers as well. Maria said, will you be sharing this ESAP framework? Yes, so you'll receive an email. I'll just go through that quickly just as a reminder. So you'll receive a certificate of attendance, a link to the pack, including a cheat sheet and the planner, a link to this recording if you missed anything and want to go back, a link to an online guide, How to Teach with Gold New Edition. So do have a look through that because it is really, really important. And do just monitor your spam box, junk box, as you'll receive this in an email 72 hours after the webinar with the email that you signed up to. So if you do use the ESAP methodology or do use this lesson, please do feel free to share it on social media with the hashtags on screen. It'll be really, really interesting to see what you thought of it and how this lesson went for you as well. So thanks so much for coming today. Thanks everyone. And I really hope that you've got something to take away, whether it be feedback, lesson planning, and yeah, just reducing the time that you spend putting into these online lessons, as I know it can be quite stressful. So thanks so much for coming. Thanks so much for participating and sharing your ideas in the chat box. And good luck and have a good rest of your day or evening, wherever you are. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.